T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Kush's Corner here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. I'm joined today once again by Phillip Lietz of Aired's Only. Tonight we're going to get into a herpetocultural discussion on philosophy, kind of how philosophies are changing over time, the ways we should look at the hobby, the reptiles we keep, and everything in between. Before I get into that, as always, USARC. So USARC is the organization that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, and to live this lifestyle. Check out usarc.org for all of the information you need to know about the organization and to keep up with any new legislation that is proposed legislation introduced either at local or national levels. And also, if you are not already a USARC member, please look into becoming a member of USARC. As a community, we have strength in numbers, and the more people that are behind the cause, the better. And we are here, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you are here on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. New podcasts drop every single day of the week from some of the best hosts in the game, talking about a wide variety of topics within the reptile industry. But if you are not on YouTube, if you're an audio-only fan like myself, we are on all of the major audio streaming platforms, be it Apple, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast from. A follow, a 5-star review, and a comment on any of those platforms would be most appreciated. With all that out of the way, let's bring Phil onto the show. How's it going, man? Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, for sure. Going good, man. Thank you very much for having me on again. I love doing these.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, last time we kind of, we had a bit of a shorter time frame to work in, and I feel like that conversation could have gone for 4 hours. So,
Yeah. It's a gift and a curse, it's
Sure.
nice to be able to just like go on and on about something that I find very interesting or very compelling, but
Yeah,
it can also be kind of a pain sometimes when, like my friends or family in a conversation, they're like, dude, can you just stop for a while? Like you're just going and going and going and going, it's like a legitimate problem,
yeah, no, I definitely get that.
Yeah, for sure.
So I said, what's new with the group, with the animals? How have things been going since we last talked?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I told you or if you like followed this on any of my pages. I moved at the beginning of the year. So we moved from an apartment into a house, and I moved the animals into the house with me into the basement. Yeah. So this was this is like the third. It's like the third time I've had to move the whole operation, which I hope to God it's the last time I have to do it, because it's brutal, as you know. I know you've done it. So it's pretty brutal, and I'd like to not have to do it again. But this was a really, really fantastic change, because even though I enjoyed having a dedicated space that was pretty spacious and substantial and allowed me to have a lot of freedom and flexibility in sort of how I managed the operation as a whole, it was outrageously expensive, and it was starting to have some effects on me in not so great of ways. It was really hard for me to feel like I could stay focused and stay dedicated to sort of like the observational regimes that I try to stick to, because I'd have to leave, or I'd have to go to my other job, or have to go home or do something with the kid, or what have you. So that made things really challenging. It started to have some pressures on me, which I think could have been avoided given some other contexts, but there were some pressures it was starting to put on me to like scale up in some pretty substantial ways that didn't feel like they were in line with some of my values as a person, and
okay.
not necessarily super bad. And I could get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
But basically, it was like, you know, the baseline demand just to sort of meet the bills of a space like that became really difficult. You know, and it was like this added weight on top of just like the apartment we were renting and everything like that. You know, but with all that said, moving everything into the house, this is sort of how I had things set before I moved into the warehouse space, you know. And even though there are some pros to being able to like disconnect when you're not there anymore, you know, just being like, I'm done, I'm not there, I'm not really thinking about it. That's a good thing. But maybe not flexibility, but like the convenience of just being able to walk downstairs and check stuff out, or like something's laying eggs in the middle of the night and I don't have to drive over to take care of it, or you know, there's not a winter storm happens and I have to go check if the power went out, or you know, whatever it is, right? So it's a lot better to have it back in my space, like my dedicated space. And it didn't force me to scale down or scale back or anything. You know, I had to get a little bit creative with like exactly how I laid everything out, the Tetris of figuring out where and how to stack enclosures and whatnot. That was a little bit challenging, but you know, we did it. And so now, and we also timed it pretty perfectly, because we were able to we closed on the house and we were able to solidify the move basically right at the beginning of the breeding season for this year. So it didn't so far anyway, it hasn't made any major impacts on the season itself. That, you know, there were maybe a couple of females that didn't end up laying eggs as a result, but that's fine. It's, you know, it was pretty minor, and that can happen anyway. You know, I don't even know if it was a result of the move. It's really nice. So
that's great.
Yeah. And so now I have a little bit more cohesion in the space. Things are, you know, anytime. So you moved as well. So you know that like when you make that move, you're able to take some of what you learned in the previous space and sort of apply it to the new space, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so I was able to really like take my time, put a lot of effort into like my cord management and setting things up so everything's very, very easy to clean and very, very easy to service. I was able to refine and repair a few enclosures that were kind of starting to get a little bit of wear and tear on them. And, you know, so I was able to patch some of that stuff up and make it a little prettier. And I was able to take some of the insights and things that I had learned by doing it in a separate space and having it have like some pressures that required a little bit more scale and a little more production, and take some of that learning and like, plug it into what I'm doing here. Sorry, I just had like an ad blocker pop up, so I was like, what the hell? But yeah, so it's been really nice, man. Really nice.
That's awesome. So is the square footage comparable from the old space to what you're using in your house, or were you just cramming more into a smaller area?
Yeah. I'm cramming more into a smaller area, but it's not that bad. Like, because at my warehouse space, I never made the leap into stacking things more than one level high.
Right. Yeah.
So all I did in moving into the smaller basement is just double up or triple up on stacking. And so everybody was able to fit where they needed to go. I had a bunch of these big melamine boxes that I had brought from my original space, and all I did was just like slap some dividers back in the middle of some of those very large pens and reduce the space just a little bit. And, you know, like I was using like 6-foot diameter kiddie pools and like these really big melamine boxes for individual animals, because I could, you know, and I was able to kind of just, you know, everybody still has lots of space and plenty of quality of life, right? But it was just a slight compression, I guess you could say.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it worked out well.
That's awesome. Yeah, man. Because I went through what you did, similar, different in a lot of ways too, but like going from having the animals off-site to in your house. I mean, I could never go back to that. I think the ideal would be like a building behind the house, 20
Yeah,
feet away.
totally. And that's actually something that I've got on the docket for me for the future, right? Like, because as it stands, one of the things I didn't consider when we moved everything into the basement is I didn't even think about like, oh yeah, baby season. I'm gonna have couple hundred baby lizards running around and I gotta have somewhere to put them, so I was like, oh my god, I realized like right before everything started hatching, I was like, where am I going to put everybody? And so I did a little bit of juggling and a little bit more compression, and so now I've got space all decked out for them, and we're good to go. But I would like to sometime in the next like 3 years or so, the plan is to put an outbuilding in the backyard because there's plenty of space there.
Good.
And that will allow me to sort of expand into that if necessary. And then another thing, and this one's going to be more of like a similar to the outbuilding is sort of like a long-term project is I also have space in the yard now to where I can do a little bit of experimentation with outdoor housing. Obviously I live in Colorado, so it's not conducive necessarily to everything year round, but I can, there's some things I can do to make it a little bit more feasible. And even if it's just for 7 months of the year, that's like a solid chunk of time where stuff can be outside, and it'll give me like a new like group, a new chunk of knowledge and experimentation and things that I can use to buff out my resume, so to speak, and just continue my own growth as a herpetoculturist.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the behaviors that you witness keeping an animal outside with the natural pattern of the sun, that teaches you a lot of how you can apply that to keeping animals indoors.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, even, like one thing I've been trying to figure out how to articulate and show and, put into some like simple visuals, right, for the sake of education is, like we have these terrariums right now that all of us use that are sort of like these steady state boxes, so even if you're using dimming and sort of like build up cool down kind of systems where you're trying to sort of simulate sunrise and sunset and all this good stuff, that's great. But for the most part, most people are keeping their diurnal reptiles, not even to include some of the more let's if we just keep it to diurnal reptiles anyway, like the lights kick on and we're effectively keeping them at like a perpetual high noon kind of scenario, And so what I've been wanting to do is like be able to use some photography and track how like a basking and hiding structure that you might use inside of an enclosure, if you were to plug that into a wild habitat or the reverse, take like a shelter in the wild and plug that into a terrarium, how the track of the sun over the day and across the year changes the nature of the structures inside the enclosure, and how the animals change the way they use the space throughout the day based on the way the sun affects that structure, so this is something that I really want to like convey, and I'd really like to I've joked in the past on my podcast about like sort of like a dream unit or system would be some kind of lighting track that like arcs across the cage throughout the day, or and then like rotates around the top of it, maybe based on the time of year. You know what I mean? Even though that's sort of it's a little bit futuristic and a little bit out in the distance, it's still something that I think it's just yet another thing that if we sort of like have it in the back of our minds and are using it as like a guiding concept, it could be beneficial,
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting you brought up the lighting thing, because that's something that I've meant to have kind of a discussion on here about just thinking about how we light our animals. It's like what's less naturalistic than how we light our animals? Yeah,
sure. Well, feed the food is, I think, we'll get it, but continue. Sorry.
No, I mean, just, I want to hear your thoughts on it, because
Yeah.
we blast these LEDs at our animals, and,
Mhm.
you can get into discussion of wavelengths and all that stuff.
Mhm.
I look at the lights and I'm like, I want to stop looking at the lights.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine that the animals are not necessarily always loving it, but then sometimes,
Mhm.
you observe them and it's like, okay, they don't seem like they're affected really, but this is where
Sure.
I'm not a scientist. So it makes me curious as to what the kind of ideal state of lighting for
Mhm.
reptiles across the board. I mean, obviously, for me, I'm looking at through the lens of almost exclusively snakes, but
Mhm.
you know, it's definitely something that I'm like I'm unsure of, and I'm curious what the answer is.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting one. I think we have, if you think about it, there's probably three, maybe four pillars of, uh, what one might call sort of terrarium design or vivarium design that really move the needle, as one would say, for our animals, right?
Yeah,
And that's lighting, diet, exercise, and then you might put in there like supplementation, or uh, you could even put in like a seasonal rhythm or something like that,
yeah,
right? And those particular pillars happen to be the areas in herpetoculture that are probably least advanced and least developed
sure,
compared to some of the more conceptual and cultural ideas that we think about when we're talking about keeping herpetofauna indoors, right?
yeah,
And I'm also not an expert by any means. Like I to this day, no matter how many times I review it, I still sort of struggle to understand or articulate like Ferguson zones. Like I understand in principle sort of what they are, but
yeah,
I can't like articulate to you exactly like the level of like why they're super important to consider, and like what the primary differences are between each zone. Like I don't have that like locked away up here.
yeah,
Maybe in 10 years I will, because I'll have repeated it enough, but right now it's just not stuck in my memory.
sure,
And uh, I think at the moment, the vast majority of herpetocultural innovation is sort of taking place inside the lighting sphere. We have a lot more people who work on this stuff on a technical level, and who sort of write papers about these things that are being really really vocal and gaining a lot of traction, which is awesome. Um, and I think that's great, and I want to see that continue.
sure,
But I also think there's a, a whole host of other levers that we can manipulate that can have
yeah,
sort of otherwise outsized effects on the animals that we work with, right?
sure,
Diet being one of them. Recently I wrote a short article about sort of like the history of the insect feeder industry.
okay,
And I was motivated to do so by a podcast that we did with Dean Missimer, he owns Dragon Hoppers, or Feed My Chameleon, I believe is like the name of his business. He focuses on breeding grasshoppers of various species, as well as like katydids, and I think he was doing mantids and stick
oh,
bugs
cool.
for a little while, things like this. But he focuses on those because they are just hands down better feeder for most of our diurnal and even nocturnal animals.
Okay,
And so I got really, really interested in this idea. So like, I was thinking to myself, like, well, okay, why is it crickets, mealworms, and waxworms that
yeah.
were sort of like the
Chosen ones.
yeah, the chosen ones, right? And when you really do a deep dive on this, what you learn is it started in the early 1900s with the bait industry. People were using crickets, mealworms, and waxworms sort of in their proto-wild form for fishing bait, and
Yeah,
then what happened was, and you had like sort of a cottage industry pop up around that, right? Like in buckets and backyards and stuff like that, farms
okay,
and stuff. And then what happened is, during World War II, the US government and the US Department of Agriculture um, started researching those insects because they were trying to better understand the transmission of pathogens from insect to people, because in World War II, there were a lot of soldiers dying. Actually, it was sort of like it was almost as many as that were dying from the fighting itself. That they wanted to know how to prevent that and how to stop some of that happening.
Sure.
And it just so happened that crickets, mealworms, and waxworms were very resilient and very easily scalable. And so it was actually the U.S. government and the Department of Agriculture that worked out all of the quirks and methods to do it at a large scale. And then when the war ended, they took all of that information that they had learned and distributed it to public entities for various purposes, whether it be farming or fishing or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right around the 50s, 60s, and 70s, well, then people realized that there was another market in not just fishing, but in the bird, like aviculture, the bird market, and zoos. And then last is zoos, aviculture, and lab rodents, lab animals, right? Yep. So lab work. And so then that grew the market further. And then in the 80s and 90s, that's when herpetoculture kind of stepped in and started really truly taking advantage of those established feeder insects. And even though that's great, it's super cool, right? And it's, even though that's very interesting and there's like a rich history there and it's extremely interesting, there was never once ever given any consideration for how like what kind of quality that those insects offered in terms of diet for the animals, you know? And so even though we have like clearly it works to a degree, right? Like I use all those feeders.
Yeah, sure.
But I think there's a great deal of room for expanding that and increasing the sort of level of like base diversity that we have in terms of what we have to offer captive reptiles and amphibians. And I'm sure that in 50, 100 years time, we'll have a much more fleshed out understanding of the knock-on effects of feeding the sort of traditional feeder insects as compared to more naturalistic ones. And you could just imagine, I mean, just think about how confounding diet research is in human beings, not to get too weird about it or anything, but everybody worries about what you're eating and what it's doing to your body. But just imagine the exact same things happening to the animals and
100%.
All these other issues and concerns that crop up in captive herpetofauna. We're so ready and eager to pin it on lighting or the way we set them up or housing or how much exercise they're getting. And to be clear, those are all factors. But I'm sure a huge amount of baseline medical issues would probably be relieved with a better quality diet. Yeah,
100%. I mean, and on the bug kind of history, I bet you could kind of follow rats and mice on the same trajectory essentially as well.
100%.
And then it kind of also then raises the question, which factor would be more important, the prey item itself or what that prey item is eating?
Totally.
Because a lot of these processed diets, I can only imagine, I don't know, but the first batch of crop that is being used for human diet goes off there. Animal diet has to be the shit that you wouldn't even feed to humans.
Totally.
So what does that look like?
Absolutely. And that there's it doesn't take much investigation to sort of peel back the various layers that may compound issues, right? Because if you mentioned rodents in particular, right? Like, those lab diets, those fortified diets for mice and rats, they are meant for large scale, low cost, high calorie, high production.
Right.
They're not intended to be they're not formulated in any way, shape, or form for the end animal that's consuming that animal, and so I think that this basically feeds in very well to the basic thrust of what most of my thinking these days kind of is around, which is
Okay.
like what are the things that we take for granted in herpetoculture that could use change or adjustment?
Mhm.
What are the misconceptions that previously termed folklore husbandry, but I think you could say, you could expand that to call it sort of like folklore herpetoculture, just
Mhm.
generally, right? Rather than just the husbandry aspect of it. There's a lot of folklore just in the overarching umbrella that contains all of herpetoculture. And then, sort of like what are some like on the ground local actionable steps that any one individual keeper can take to
Yeah.
to to either work against those things or like take a track towards improvement broadly,
Sure.
yeah, really fun stuff. I think it's super cool.
Yeah. 100%. So then, I mean, on the feeder topic, what are your current thoughts as to, I guess let's keep it with
Yeah,
insect, but
yeah.
as to what the next steps would be that you would like to see
Mhm.
towards, advancing herpetoculture in terms of
Yeah,
diet.
yeah. So I think the first and the easiest thing that any one person can do, um, let's frame it this way. So let's pretend we could go back in time to an era sort of before any of the traditional feeder insects were available.
Yeah.
If you were a herpetoculturist, you probably had to become really familiar with the ecology and natural history of the given species that you work with.
Sure.
And it was by necessity, not by interest. You had to.
Right.
And so uh, I think that all of us ought to try to take steps towards like internalizing some of that particular requirement that people had back in the day to do now, which is to say, how do you find and source wild foods for your stuff
Yeah.
in a way that can be beneficial to not just the animals but to your wallet, even to your state of mind, like there's probably it's probably 10 times more rewarding to turn on your porch light and get out there at night with a butterfly net and snatch all the moths that you can get in a 30-minute time frame, put them in a jar, and feed them to your collared lizard the next day.
Yeah.
It's probably 10 times more rewarding to do that
Sure.
than it is to drive down to the shop and pick up crickets and throw them in the cage. Um, some of it's going to be patronizing people who are trying to do that themselves, like Dean, the gentleman I mentioned before. Like I have a standing order with him
Okay.
for a small number of grasshoppers once a month, and
Mhm.
and it's all I can do at the moment. But as time goes along, I would prefer to have the option to just buy grasshoppers as feeders and just
Okay.
never buy crickets again. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with the cricket necessarily. It's just in principle, it's just like for myself. Like I don't like to go to McDonald's. I'm more likely to just cook some chicken and vegetables for me and my family.
Yeah.
Like it's just a better choice. And
Sure.
so I think it's mostly that. And then if you take it one step further, let's say you're an extremely industrious person like Dean. Well, maybe then, okay, perhaps you might be the person who decides, well, it turns out I'm pretty savvy producing this whatever, like
Mhm.
this other insect that's like a great feeder. And I
Mhm.
think isopods, there's hundreds of different kinds of isopods that people keep.
Yeah.
A lot of them are excellent feeders,
Okay.
for various stuff. And like, for example, my xenogama, they go nuts for different kinds of isopods, stuff like this. I mean, even uh, it's also true that like something I used to talk about a lot was like bees and wasps. I would t- catch wasps that would fly into my shop, or my mom has beehives that she has in her backyard,
Oh, wow.
and occasionally the hives will kick out bees that are either dying or like intruders or whatever it is,
Mhm.
or wasps that came in to try to steal honey that they beat the crap out of and kicked out of the hive. I would take all of those and gather them from the ground in front of the hives and feed them to the xenogama,
Oh, wow.
um, and they love them. I mean, that one seems like an easy parallel move, because there's already a huge industry around beekeeping. So, I mean, there's no reason in my mind that you couldn't, in theory, use bees as feeders on some level. It'd just be another reason for people to keep bees. And we all know that we need more bees in the world, right? So I literally only just thought about that just now, but like there's probably hundreds of different viable alternatives. I mean, even just the three that we started with: crickets, mealworms, waxworms. Since the advent of all of those being industrialized, there's lots more stuff that's come up, right? Superworms, roaches, hornworms, silkworms, black soldier fly larvae, right? So that's awesome. That's brilliant. And I think more of that is fruit flies, bean beetles, banded crickets. These are all excellent choices. And I don't necessarily mean that anybody should never feed the sort of the big three to their animals, because again, I do it all the time. But I just mean the idea of like having this in the back of your mind is something that you can, another lever that you can play with at any given point in time.
Sure. Yeah. So then, how do you quantify with the end result of reptile the benefits of these kind of unconventional feeders, so to speak?
Okay, that's a really, really good question. So I think two ways. Two primary ways. The first is going to be, we're going to need people who just simply run the studies, right? So if you're even a remotely academic person, maybe you're the person to take time out of your own schedule or apply for a grant that can get you the ability to straight up do whatever sort of physiological test is necessary to do, placebo-controlled trials of different feeders, right? People are going to have to do this. But in a more direct, immediate way, this would simply be this would just be paying attention to the difference in reaction from your animals. So couple of examples. The way my xenogomma reacted to bees and wasps was very high. It was a big reaction. When people, I knew a dude who lived in Arizona, and he would pack up scorpions that he would just, be crawling around his backyard at night. He'd put them all in a container and he'd send them to me, and I would feed those scorpions to my collared lizards back in the day. And again, massive reaction from the collared lizards. So I think being able to like examine the behavior and the reaction that your animals give you to certain foods, seeing how that affects their behavior, seeing how it affects their bowel movements, seeing how it affects their appetite going forward, see what it does to their body composition, right? Those are some things that you can just directly observe yourself. I mean, even something as simple as like, I could easily envision someone breeding scorpions to feed to animals, right? Like a lot of animals love scorpions and spiders and things like this. I think it would probably be beneficial for herpetoculture as a whole to reconfigure their sort of moral and ethical conceptions around feeding geckos, frogs, and small lizards to other reptiles. A lot of people kind of get squirmy around that makes them feel uncomfortable.
Sure.
But like, if you tried to tell me that the idea that you might have that reaction to like feeding a gecko to a collared lizard, but you don't have that reaction feeding a pinky to a collared lizard is like a little absurd, right?
Right.
Those rats and mice are awesome. They're super cool, super cute, intelligent, fun, great animals. So if you're comfortable feeding a rodent, you should probably be comfortable feeding a tadpole or a frog or a gecko or a lizard to another.
For sure.
It doesn't mean it's not fraught with, it's like controversial terrain, but I'm not, who cares, so.
Well, and they kind of, that gets into an interesting philosophical debate about kind of, the anthropomorphization that happens. And, even just something that simple right there, like, the thought of a feeder lizard or a feeder snake is like repulsive to a decent amount of herpetoculture, where it's like, okay, well, you get your box of 200 large mice and put it in the freezer and don't think about it. Like,
Well, and
Where do you, here's the disconnect for you, friend.
right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. And actually I was on Trap Talk at, like, I think at the end of last year, pretty sure. And on that show, I talked about the idea of like a ceiling and a floor for some of the way we talk about like herpetoculture in general. So like in the same way that we might say, okay, as we scale up in size and complexity with regard to species, we start to get into sort of ethically fraught territory, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way that I might think it's a little awkward to keep something like a retic or a crocodilian or a crocodile monitor or something like that in captivity. Not entirely. I don't think it's like 100% wrong, but I just feel like it's a very high bar that you have to meet to be able to do that, right?
Sure.
We probably have to have like a floor for the same kind of idea, right? So like, it's a little odd. Like, I don't necessarily think we should be worried about the experience of a mealworm or a cricket or a waxworm.
Yeah.
But it's not irrational to think about that, you know?
Sure.
And so if we're going to have a ceiling to it, we got to have a floor, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I think, and I think like there's like a broad phrase that I've started using over the last couple of months about that kind of, I think, encapsulates all of like a lot of the thinking that I put into herpetoculture, which is resource aware care systems. So a resource aware care system is a way of thinking that considers the needs, your needs and your animal's needs, and the way those things overlap based on the resources that you have available to you.
Sure.
So some simple examples of this would be people who live in Florida, Arizona, or Southern California who keep their animals outdoors, and the resources at hand that they either choose to utilize or choose to disregard. Mm-hmm. Or in my case, I've spent the last 3 months feeding entirely wild weeds to my herbivores. Right. And it's just because I happen to have them in the backyard, and I use a set of resources available to me, which is plant identification apps that will ID plants based on a photo. Mm-hmm. And then I take that identification and then I plug it into something like the tortoise table or an AI. And I use those as a reference to give me a clear understanding of whether or not that food is either safe or good to feed the animal that I keep. Yeah. And I do that based on how that wild food compares on like a physiological level to the plants that exist in the wild habitat of the animal I'm feeding it to.
Okay.
And so then those are resources at my disposal that I am aware of that influence my care regime.
Sure.
But it doesn't have to be anywhere near that extreme for the average person to be utilizing the concept of a resource-aware care system.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. In the specific instance of that, are you, I mean, I figure you don't use any, but are you concerned about neighbors or the neighborhood ever using pesticides?
Of course. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, so actually that brings up two points on that topic that I think are quite interesting. So of course I never spray pesticides or herbicides in my yard. I do ask my one neighbor, because I only live adjacent to one house.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, the rest of it's like just sort of open space and median next to me. So I don't, as long as I know that my neighbor isn't spraying those things, then I can reasonably assume that I'm okay.
Yeah.
So I don't worry too much about that. But even if I knew that all my neighbors around me were spraying pesticides, well, I know that I can go to open space or to BLM land or to something, and or open fields that just aren't maintained. Like I can assume that those are probably going to be pretty safe. Sure. But then it also brings in the other question I get all the time is this idea of like, aren't you worried about parasites, and aren't you worried about all this stuff? And short answer is no. Long answer is, yeah, sure, of course, you know. But my thinking basically goes something along the lines of, the odds of, I'm probably less likely to transmit something harmful to my animals by catching like a wild insect and feeding it to them. I'm probably less likely to give them something than I am if I go to the store and buy overcrowded, underfed, not, like insects that are store bought. I mean, you're way more likely to give them something from the store than you are from something in the wild, right? So if you don't think twice about going to the pet shop and picking up mealworms and crickets and feeding it to your animal, then you probably shouldn't think that much about it when you pull them from the wild. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be aware of it, but it's the same. It's the same solution no matter which source you take, right? So if something starts happening with your animals, well, you take them to the vet and you figure it out. Most of the I've never had it I've been doing this I've been feeding wild foods for like 20 years, and I've never had a problem, never. So it doesn't mean it won't ever happen, but it's just, I have tools at my disposal in the event that it does happen. And I try to take all the precaution that I need to.
And I feel like the same thing could be said for like, collecting wood pieces or leaf litter or something from the wild, I personally have very rarely done any sort of preventative measures for anything like that. And people are always worried. The main one, which just comes down to a lack of information as well. I'm worried about getting mites. It's like,
for sure.
You don't live in the Southern Hemisphere. You're good.
Yeah, you're very unlikely. Yeah.
They don't exist here.
Yes.
For starters. And then, but then, I guess it's reasonable to be concerned about other potential bugs or parasites or whatever. But it's the same thing where it's like, go to a reptile show, you are 1 billion times more likely to bring something back. I mean, like I I've used like outside branches for my Mangshan vipers, and the worst thing that happened is that they're now really poised in the cage. That are they're doing something beneficial.
Yeah, I just had the same thing happen, man. I put some wild wood in the enclosure for my my Moroccan Greek tortoises, and I went in there a few days ago and I found a whole bunch of roly-polies under the leaf litter, just like going to town on a turd. And I was like, all right, sweet, let's go. It's awesome. It's probably a net good, and this also pertains to another passion of mine, which is like learning to have enough knowledge about what you're keeping and what their life is like out there in the wild to be able to trust them to tell you what they need to tell you, like this is phrased as, in general, people phrase this as like being observant, right? Paying attention to your animals, because if you learn their habits and their routines and their quirks and their personalities, then you're much more able to spot anomalies when and if they occur. And so, I think it's really important to have that and to pay attention. But the reason that's so important is because it allows you to place trust in them and trust that they know what they need and what they don't, and they can there's a lot they can handle without any input from you at all, and it's hard because I've been through the same phase. I had a phase in my career where I was parasite paranoid, and I was sure that the animals, just like it, if they ever bred, it was going to be by the skin of my teeth, and there was going to be all kinds of problems, and I'd have to figure it out. And like if you get the fundamentals of what you're doing in place, then almost all of the rest is going to happen without you. It's going to have nothing to do with you, which is why so many people say things like most herpetoculturists are like glorified shit scoopers,
right. Yeah.
Which is true, I think.
You should be if you're doing it right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 100%. And so I think you have to get your foundation in place and be willing to trust that the animals, like, they'll do what they've got to do if you set everything. And it's very, very rare. Like, Okay, different analogy, right? So
Mm.
like let's talk about jujitsu for a split second, right? In submission grappling and jujitsu and judo and wrestling and all this stuff, there's this idea that like people tend to be very careful about the partners they choose to spar with, because the idea is that like, oh, I don't want to get hurt.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you're whether or not you get hurt, I would say 99% of the time is totally on you, right? Because almost every time I've seen someone get hurt, with rare exception, but most of the time,
Mm.
it's because the person who got hurt made the wrong decision, let their ego get in the way, and didn't tap when they should have, didn't know to stop when they should have, didn't know how to break fall, didn't know how to whatever, you know what I mean? And I think that's true in herpetoculture to the extent that if you have all your stuff in place, and don't get me wrong, you don't start with the knowledge to get all the foundation correct. Most of our progress as herpetoculturists is like working out the kinks that get us to a base foundation.
Oh yeah.
Right. So, but once you have that base foundation in place, it's usually when things go wrong, it's going to be anomalous, right? Like some other problem that you weren't aware of, like, or something like that. But most of the people who I coach through breeding their uromastics for the first time, raising their xenogama to adulthood, like whatever it is, if something goes wrong, almost always we can find a kink in the armor somewhere where, your nest box was not properly constructed. They didn't know how to use it. They didn't recognize it as a nest box. Or, you've been feeding lentils every day for 5 years. Like that's a problem, like that's a big problem. Like whatever it is, those tend to be the sources of mistake or failure. It's very rare that if you have everything at the foundation in place, it's rare for stuff to go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I guess then for people who are maybe newer to keeping or newer to observing their animals with more of a critical eye, what are those things that you are looking for that show you signs that something needs to be corrected?
Oh, sure. I wish I could get into like explicit specifics there, but it's going to depend on what animal. So much of it's going to depend on what animal you're keeping, because like if I was keeping a bearded dragon and it decided not to eat for 2 weeks, I might be kind of concerned.
Sure.
I might be like, oh, something might be kind of weird here, right? But if I have a uromastix or a tortoise, there could be a whole host of other reasons why it decided not to. Like it could just be, it could be brumation, it could be estivation during the summer, it could be that it's like working out something in its own system, like it just doesn't feel good. Maybe it's got a cold. You know what I mean? Like that stuff just happens sometimes, and it doesn't immediately mean that something's inherently wrong with what you're doing, because animals do that. Like a lot of animals will do that from time to time, and so what you have to do is you have to get very familiar with not just the individual but the species as a whole and their wild ecology, because that will tell you, that usually will give you enough of if then circumstances to where you can tell if something's wrong. But it would be hard to get into specifics,
Yeah, no, that for sure. And especially through the framework of lizards, because I feel like with snakes, you can make many more broad generalizations with snakes than you can with lizards.
Totally.
So
yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And there's also so much about well, that also brings into the conversation another idea, which is like in the same way that people like us, we know it's probably pretty good for you to experience really high heat and really cold colds from time to time, right? Like whether that's your sauna or your cold plunge, whatever, right? It's probably good for you to experience physiological stress, which is to say deadlifting or going on a run or wrestling for an hour or something like that, right? Like it's a stressful physiological thing, but it results in good, right? It's probably good for you to occasionally fast for a day. Yeah.
I'm on hour 40 right now.
Let's go, dude. Very good. Nice. Yeah. So I do the same.
That may come up during the conversation. I had a feeling.
I mean, you and I have similar, I think we have sort of similar worldviews from time to time. So I think that's fair.
Sure.
Yeah. But, um, that's probably true for the animals as well. Like
Yeah,
it's
sure.
it's probably a good thing to implement very cold extremes from time to time and within reason for your animals, especially during the winter. It's
Yeah,
probably good for them to not eat for a few days at a time here and there. It's probably good to, and it's probably good to like totally make it chaotic and inconsistent in ways,
yeah,
right? Like, you might take like a week and say, okay, Sunday fast, Monday, I'm going to give them 5 flowers, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, nothing, and then Thursday, Friday, all the flowers they can eat, and then Saturday, Sunday fast. Like something like that. That's probably going to be better for them than 3 flowers a day every day, 365.
yeah,
It's also going to be more fun psychologically for the animal because
sure.
um, we as keepers, we always have to walk this line between what's going to be good for them and what is sort of like ethically questionable,
Mm,
because some people would consider fasting them or exposing them to extremes or stresses as like this could technically be considered unethical in some level, right? Because the animal, they're not like consenting to it. You
yeah,
know
they're
what I
not
mean?
supposed to matter. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but this is why all that ecology really matters so much, because you have to know what the biology and the software of your animal is looking for,
right.
because they don't know anything else. They just
Yeah,
don't. They're not tuned for anything else, right?
yeah. I mean, I guess you could almost kind of like draw a parallel of like, if you don't let your kid eat sugar all day, that's
Yeah,
abusive to the kid because that's what it wants. It's like, okay, well,
sure.
you know better, obviously, as the parent. So like,
Yep.
you know,
Hmm.
you're doing something for the well-being of the thing that is in your care who doesn't have the wherewithal to do it for themselves otherwise.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, and this is what I know Roy, my podcast co-host, has
Mhm.
he always the word he always uses for this is stewardship.
Yeah,
You are not simply maintaining or caring for these animals, you're stewarding them through their life on some level.
sure.
And so that comes with it a certain kind of responsibility that, if you can take it to some pretty interesting extremes the more you think about it. And who knows, I mean, maybe in a couple hundred years we might have like, in the same way that we have like a pit bull and a chihuahua and a Great Dane, we might have bearded dragons that look that diverse,
Yeah,
or
sure.
something. I think it's not unreasonable at all.
I mean, I think we're already there to an extent with bearded dragons, where wild bearded dragons and captive bearded dragons are just physiologically not the same animal.
Not even close. It's so weird, man. And I think I think things are going to get a lot weirder in the next 30, 50 years. I mean,
Totally,
because
yeah.
I've been thinking about the ways that some of these advancements in AI are gonna change herpetoculture.
Yeah,
And
sure.
I recently, I'm not done with it. I have like a short article about it on my Patreon, but I'm working on a larger one that sort of fantasizes about the ways that technological advancement will change herpetoculture.
Mm,
And I have a companion article to it that I wrote about the axolotl. Because if you're, I mean, all of us know what an axolotl is,
yeah,
but fewer of us, not a lot of people know about it, but not everybody knows about how the history of the axolotl is really weird and really interesting.
hmm,
So, like, just as a really brief overview, first brought into captivity in Paris in like the 1880s or something like that,
okay,
1870s. So like a long time ago, and they became a craze like right away. And the founding population of all the axolotls up until a certain point in recent history was like 6 or 8 individuals, all of them. Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. But on top of that, axolotls, they have almost all of them are genetically modified, right? So they have, whether it's to glow, right? They have that bioluminescent DNA from, it's like a
yeah,
jellyfish or a fish or something like that.
okay,
They are a GMO herp. But on top of that, the albino axolotl is the result of splicing in albino tiger salamander DNA into the axolotl.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, dude, they have the wildest history. So the I use the axolotl as kind of like a framework to think about, like, this isn't the future. This is right now. Like, this is as it stands right now. So think about how, we were talking about like lighting and diet and stuff like that. All of that's going to change based on insights gained from technological advancement. Sure. But I think the reptiles themselves will change, because if you can imagine something like CRISPR becoming democratized and available to, like more private citizens, that alone would change everything about herpetoculture, right? From, in the article, I talk about smuggling, like what happens when you're not looking for lizards or snakes in a suitcase and you're looking for a flash drive with genetic information. That would change the Endangered Species Act, right? Because now it would change the Endangered Species Act, presumably to mostly focus on like wild habitat conservation and not necessarily about like captive propagation, because you have the genetic information at hand. You can make Fiji banded iguanas anytime you want. You can just make them with CRISPR, right? So you can adjust them. What happens to the hybrid discussion and pure species and locality discussions when you not only can maintain a pure line as much as you want, but also when you can make, in the same way that we took an albino tiger salamander and made an albino axolotl from that. What happens when we talk about like a bat eater hybrid constrictor? Well, what happens when it's like, I'm going to mix a Eurymastix with a Fiji crested iguana because I can, like, I can do it, like everything goes out the window. There's no need for worrying about hybrids, because you can always generate a pure species if you need it. You get to, you can truly and literally define a locality based on some sort of genetic markers, right? Everything changes when that kind of tech enters private herpetoculture, and maybe it won't, but it could,
that's absolutely insane to think about.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a total mind blower, right? Like it would all go out the window. And I already have the stance that none of that stuff matters anyway, right? Like I don't necessarily, it doesn't mean I value all of it. I value pure species. I value locality. I value hybrids. I value morphs, all of it, right? But I also think that the borders between all of those things are essentially arbitrary and human imposed, and don't necessarily have a whole lot of value in a captive context, So the second you pull in technology of that particular kind of power, all that goes out the window. It's just unnecessary, So and that's just that, I've also been thinking about like, we were talking again, going back to like lighting and diet and husbandry and all this stuff. I've been envisioning and like, sort of fantasizing about a future where I can buy a package that includes like an ornate Eurymastix and a state-of-the-art enclosure that what you would do is, like, conceivably you would pair that enclosure to an app on your phone, type in the locality that you're looking to mimic or recreate, and it automatically does that on a temperature, humidity, light level for you, and tunes it to the seasons on its own. And what happens when you have levels of customization to the inside of your enclosure that allows you to get really creative with, like, instead of having a static enclosure that looks this way all the time unless you get in there and mess with it, what happens when you can do that in a way that's a lot more plug and play? Having systems that might even respond in real time to the animal and what it's doing and what its needs are, in a way that almost removes the keeper from that level of involvement. Maybe that'd be good or bad, I don't know, but it's a fun concept to play around with. And I think something like that is probably not that far.
Yeah, I mean, just by the thought of, programming a system based off of, just kind of
climate data.
Yeah, data points.
Yeah.
That probably is not all that difficult. I
No.
probably couldn't do it, but somebody who knows how to, do all that techno stuff,
Probably doing it now.
Pretty easy. Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Maybe apply some current technology in a different way.
Yeah, somebody's gonna message me and be like, "I do that, nerd." Like, leave me, and I'll be like, "I get it. You're awesome. Good for you." You know.
100%. Well, I want to take a quick break real quick. We got to go to a couple of commercials, but we'll be right back here in a couple minutes to continue the conversation.
One of the biggest growths we have in the reptile industry today are the rare species of reptiles that aren't worked with. That's right. That's why I went ahead and partnered up again with Brian Susan over at SUNDOWN Reptiles. Brian works with species such as kahua geckos, gargoyle geckos, all species of tree monitors. He works with Abronia and many other cool species geckos that you can check out all on his website. Head over to sundownreptiles.com, see what he has available. Brian's one of the best doing it in the reptile industry today. He's been on the show multiple times, so make sure you check out all of Brian Susan's episodes on Trap Talk Reptile Network. But more importantly, for the highest quality of captive bred reptiles, make sure you head over to sundownreptiles.com and make sure you give him a follow on Instagram. Thank you again, Brian Susan over at Sundown Reptiles. One of the things I love about being a part of the reptile industry is all the learning, okay? Learning can be fun, and I can prove that to you. Thank you so much to today's sponsor. It's Gary Scavino over at gs.reptiles. I highly recommend you head over to his YouTube channel, follow all this man's content when it comes to learning about rare species of snakes you could be keeping in the hobby, and also just finding out how easy a lot of these rare species of snakes are to keep in general. So thank you so much, Gary Scavino of GS Reptiles. Again, head over to his YouTube channel. Also head over to his Instagram to be on top of all of his current work and be ready for a big year over at GS Reptiles. Thank you so much, Gary, for your ongoing support. I really appreciate it. Chee! Sorry for the interruption, folks, but a quick word from our sponsors. Green tree pythons, emerald tree boas, and plenty other arboreal snakes have been quite the popularity here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network, which brings me to today's sponsor, the Reptile Perch. Head over to thereptileperch.com and Reptile Perch on Instagram. See what type of design PVC perch is best for your arboreal reptile. But first and foremost, I would also check out David Brom's Green Tree Python availability on the website. And you can also check out his Instagram just to stay current on any projects or any productions that he posts. Thank you so much, David Broms, for your ongoing support. Looking forward to seeing what you have to show in the 2025 season. When you think about building a good community and being a leader of that community, nobody comes to mind better than Mark Hager over at Texas Chondros. That's right. Make sure you head over to TX Chondros on Instagram and also head over to Mark's website. See what he has available Green Tree Python wise and be ready for quite the 2025 Green Tree Python breeding season out of Mark Hager. He's a veteran in the Green Tree Python game, one of the best and nicest breeders in the Green Tree Python game. He's been putting on the whole state of Texas for as long as I've known him. So if you want to see all the amazing other chondro keepers out of the state of Texas, another good reason to go follow Mark Hager over at TX Chondros on Instagram. And again, head over to his website, texaschondros.com. You can find all the links in the description below. Thank you so much, Mark Hager, for supporting the trap. Cheers.
Alrighty, everybody, we are back. So one thing that I kind of was curious to ask you about, you've made a lot of these posts kind of about your thought process behind a lot of these theories. Have you gotten much pushback on the stuff you've been saying? Because it definitely like can break. It's theorizing, breaking the mold of how herpetoculture has been thought of for decades now, and a lot of people are really protective of the kind of the old school ways.
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. Maybe maybe yes and no.
Okay.
So I think I try not to be too provocative. Like I'm not trying to fight people. I do that enough at the academy, right? I don't need to spar with people online, but I also I try to phrase things in, like, for example, like when I talk about like the hybrid pure species morph thing, like I never say that we don't need those things. Like we really do, you know, like just because I have no problem with morphs or hybrids or what have you, it doesn't mean that I think that like pure stuff or locality or any or wild type or anything like that isn't interesting. I still think that has great value, and that basically the way I always try to phrase it is like we can have our cake and eat it too, you know, like it's fine. With that said, I've had some pushback on a couple of things. Like I've had pushback when I say things like wild type is an illusion, or like the borders between species are human-made constructs, or things like that. I've had folks push back on that, and they're totally fair, right? Like for example, with regard to the species distinction has no like inherent value, right? That, well, actually, that's not what I say at all. Let me try that again. Rather than saying that they don't have value, it's just saying that a species distinction is a human construct.
Yeah.
You know, basically the pushback is like, well, you know, you have no authority to say that, and the tools we're using to distinguish between distinct species are getting better, and you know, what about the ramifications of that? And I'm like, yeah, no, those are all totally fair, right? Like, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a geneticist, fair enough, you know. But I try really hard to stand behind ideas that are pretty verifiable, you know, like you could, you know, I try not to say things that are like out of pocket, as the youth say, right? Like I try not to go too far.
Yeah.
But then further, with the other one I'll get pushback on from time to time is my thinking that what we're really doing is domestication on a nascent level. Like it's the very beginnings of what is a domestication process.
Sure.
And then I'll get pushback on some of the criticisms that I have for things like the Four Freedoms concept, which is like a animal welfare concept established by zoos, I think in Europe or the UK a long time ago. And then the other one is like the 5 domains, right? Which is like an expansion of the Four Freedoms and the 5 domains. These are like welfare frameworks that are designed to increase welfare for animals in captivity. And admittedly, the pushback is minimal. I would love more. I would welcome more pushback, because that's how I grow. You know, like I love when somebody comes and hits me up in the DMs and is like, I think you're way off on this. I'm like, hell yeah, dude. Like, let's hear it. You know, because then I get to have a conversation, and either I come away better with more information, or I get to say like, I don't think you're right. You know, and then that person gets to either take that or refute it or whatever they want. It's fine. But part of my challenges to things like the Four Freedoms or the 5 domains is that they tend to be, number one, they tend to be very mammal centric, right? They don't necessarily tend to cater to herpetofauna or things like this. This is mostly to mammals and birds and things like that, which is great. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily apply in the same way to herpetofauna. And then additionally, I think that I'm really, really interested in both domestication and herpetoculture in particular as a miniaturization of what's called niche construction theory. So niche construction theory is the idea that, like, you know, historically people have thought about evolution, the process of evolution, as primarily a feature of the natural world that happens to animals, right? But niche construction theory frames it more like it's something that's happening in concert between the animal and the environment.
Sure.
So another way of framing this is like, you know, let's think about like plankton, right? Like the evolution of plankton changed the chemistry of the atmosphere of the planet. That is the animal having a direct impact on the environment that then enforces more constraints on the organism, which changes the organism and then changes the environment as a result of the organism changing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. How could it not be? How could it be seen another way?
Well, I think the traditional view of evolutionary biology has said that, again, that animals are sort of the passive recipients of evolutionary pressure. but you know, there are people who say that, who would argue that traditional evolutionary biology actually works in the framework of niche construction theory as a part of evolutionary biology. It kind of goes back and forth, right? So I can't adjudicate whether or not one is more right than the other or anything like that. But I like the idea of niche construction theory with regard to herpetoculture, because if you take that concept and apply it to what we do, well, what that does is it informs keepers to be an active participant in the same way that their animal is an active participant in the construction of the niche of herpetoculture and of your enclosures in your space. And I think that some of these welfare frameworks for a lot of animal husbandry, while they are really, really great and should be utilized, and we should think about them, and there's nothing like inherently wrong with them. I don't think they tend to be more of that sort of traditional evolutionary biology approach, where they're sort of like the animal is a recipient of the environment that we're enforcing on it, rather than an active participant. And I want the future of this to be something where it's that feedback loop. It's both, right? So like, we're influencing them, they're influencing us, and we're changing each other in concert, rather than I'm doing things and the animal deals with it. Right. So because I think that's a pretty important thing. I also don't enjoy a lot of the terminology that we use in herpetoculture and in captive animal management has a tendency to have like a negative slant to it, which is fair, right? Like, I get why, you know, we keep animals in captivity, right? People talk about the way animals cope with captivity and things like this. And I don't think, even though I think that's like an understandable perspective to take away, I think it's probably better, for various reasons, that we think about it less in terms of a negative framing and more in terms of like, what are we both getting out of this? You know, so like as a very, very base level example, and I know people might quibble with like using the 4 freedoms as an example, because it's like, even the 4 freedoms might be a little bit outdated, but it's like,
what are they?
The 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms are basically like, animals should be free from starvation, free from thirst, free from stress, and free from extremes, I think. Like, and I might be butchering that to some degree, but it's some basic framework like that. And the idea is predicated on the idea that like, the animals didn't consent to be brought indoors. They were in the wild, and now they're here, and they didn't consent to that. It's like, okay, well, fair enough, but the animals didn't consent to be born in the wild either. They just showed up. They just found themselves there, right? There's no guarantee of those 4 freedoms in the wild at all, right? In the wild, they are not. They are constrained, just as they are here. And so I just feel like they're not, they're incomplete on some level. They're very informative, but just incomplete, you know? And so this brings me to another like framework that I've been toying around with that I really, really like, which is the idea of liminal herpetofauna. So what I mean by liminal herpetofauna is herpetofauna that exists in the wild, but in a way that it's directly involved with human settlement and human involvement, right? So you could think about, I think I talked about some of this on the last show, right? So you could think about, you know, spiny-tailed iguanas that live on the hotel grounds of a hotel in Costa Rica. They eat the grass on the lawn. They eat the fruit that the tourists give them. They are protected from predators to a degree by the presence of people. I mean, all kinds of stuff. The geckos that live on the ceiling of a restaurant somewhere in a tropical place, right? That's liminal herpetofauna. And the reason I'm interested in those animals in particular is because, from my view, those animals stand to elucidate to us very important lifestyles and adaptations and use of the human wild interface that ought to inform our herpetoculture. Because when you have an animal that lives in these spaces, they're tending to reveal to you the extremes of their needs. you know, because it's not as it tends to be habitat that's not quite as diverse, or might be diverse in different ways
Yeah.
from a more pure wild, which I don't think exists either. That's like a conceptual fallacy. So
Sure.
you know, so especially given niche construction theory, like that's just not real. Like human free wild doesn't exist on some level. But you know, I think that stuff tends to be super, super educational. And so another small example of this is I recently read this book about foxes. It was by oh man, here I can find it really fast just because it's a cool title. It's The Hidden World of the Fox by Adele Brand. And there was a snippet of information that I took from that book and put on my Instagram. And there was a study conducted where they looked at the like pathogenic load of foxes that interacted with human settlement, and compared that to the pathogenic load of foxes that existed in a more like disconnected from humans wild environment. And foxes that were like eating cat food and eating food left out by people and like existing in the more near human space had way fewer parasites and better body condition and all this stuff than their more wild counterparts. You know, totally reasonable thing and understandable, right? But that right there is like, those animals are taking full advantage of the benefits of being liminal wildlife to human settlement. You know, and I think that area where they overlap like that is a very, very interesting. I find that particular overlap extremely compelling, and I feel like it has a lot to teach us about herpetoculture. You know?
Yeah, I mean, even like, you know, taking instance like water monitors in Bangkok.
Yeah.
They're huge. These things are absolutely massive. And, you know, that animal is, for one, considering the generalist nature of that species, if that environment wasn't conducive, they wouldn't exist in that environment.
Totally. Yeah, that's right.
Because they don't need to. And, you know, the animal is clearly thriving. So it's not forced into this environment. It's not, you know, this is not a constraint that's being put on this animal, but yet here it is in a natural environment and seemingly arguably doing better than those who are, you know, deep in the jungles. So.
Yeah. And on some level, because of the sort of unbounded nature of the wild world, they are choosing to utilize that niche, you know? Now, of course, like, yes, obviously this doesn't apply in the same way to things like elephants or tigers or dolphins, right? Things get more complicated when we talk about more complex creatures, right? And yes, there's an argument that the closer you get to human settlement, there's less biodiversity. Like, fair enough. Like, that's a problem. But I still think that these liminal species have a way of reinforcing that idea that if you ever watch like a Planet Earth documentary, David Attenborough will say this kind of thing all the time. Like, we have to find a way to live with an abundant biosphere, you know? And so I think that, you know, in a time and in a world where we really desperately have to find ways to justify herpetoculture, right? Which I don't think we're lacking in justification at all. But you know, I've said in past interviews that like the don't tread on me attitude, even though I get it. I too am a gun owner, you know, like I get it. It's not sufficient, you know? So we have to have
the conversation of a living being.
If
it's a gun or a whatever, you know, that's one thing. But like, when I was like, oh, why do you keep a 18-foot Burmese python? It's like, because you can't tell me not to. It's like,
right. That's not enough.
You should be able to have a better explanation than that. Like, that just makes you sound unintelligent.
That's right. And it puts a bad light on herpetoculture.
Yeah, we're trying to justify what we do to people who don't do it. That's the worst approach possible. You couldn't think of a worse way to address that situation.
Totally. And so I think that, again, that sort of liminal wildlife has a way of elucidating to us that there's an aspect of herpetoculture that can inform us about the wild world, and in a way that is happening with species that don't get otherwise important conservation attention.
Sure.
Because they're not the charismatic megafauna, right? And then so again, to get just a smidge futuristic on you here, like we're all going to become a spacefaring species one day, right? Like the whole idea is to have backup colonies of humans on more than just planet Earth, right? Yeah. It doesn't feel like a stretch to me to envision a time in which herpetoculture is sufficiently advanced and there's a sufficient amount of scientific rigor and cross-pollination between scientific disciplines in the private sector that there could be a day when robot Elon Musk knocks on your door to say, hey, like we're trying to set up a colony on Mars, but we're missing all of these species that make the sustainability of that colony absolutely a failure. We need to know about herpetofauna, like, and how they interact in the food webs and in the ecosystem that we're trying to set up there. So like that doesn't seem, maybe to some that seems quite far-fetched. And say what you will about Elon, I get it, but I think in general, I think that is a real possibility on some level. And so the more we, I think that's where that liminal wildlife really starts to become important for herpetoculture.
I mean, man, the idea of like doing an export to Europe or Asia seems kind of daunting. Imagine doing an export to Mars.
Hell yeah. I know. How do you do it? It'd be crazy. Yeah, it's just like, imagine the paperwork you need to ship a Euromastix to Mars.
Like, I'm not giving a live arrival guarantee. No way. That is on you.
That's absurd. That's awesome. Yeah, for sure. So I think, and again, I know it sounds far-fetched, but I really think that there are going to be, and this would also bring me to this other thing that I think about a lot, which is like, there are all these sort of scientific, and conservation, like there's this thing that people say all the time, like, oh, we're not doing conservation. And okay, like I understand what you mean.
Conservation.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, yes, on a base level, you're not conserving like a wild population or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't elements of conservation that happen in herpetoculture, but like on the same level, it's also not just about all of that. I think that there are profound psychological benefits that come from having a diverse array of companion animals, like both for people, and for, another thing that I've been thinking about a lot too is how like, I read this book by Tyler Cowen. It's called Create Your Own Economy. And it's not what it sounds like at the outset. It's not like about how to be a successful business person, really. It's not like that. It's not like that. But he basically talks about how with the way the world is going and sort of the advent of all this tech and all this stuff that we're using on a very high level, he basically makes the argument that people with an autistic cognitive style are better suited for some of that sort of techie future on some level. I think, and I, having met a hell of a lot of herpers, I think that there's like there's an element to which certain people with certain autistic cognitive styles are very well suited to herpetoculture, because you are having to interpret an animal that doesn't have the same kind of body language and metrics that you would use for a dog or a cat or a guinea pig or a horse or a chicken. And so when Philippe de Vogely says that you're learning about another form of consciousness, I think we're going to need different types of human consciousness to interpret those different conscious beings.
Sure. I mean, anyone who's done any sort of education with reptiles, I've been around some severely disabled kids that you put a snake in their hands or a lizard and they turn into a different human.
It's cool.
It's amazing. And the fact that someone could look at that and be like, oh wow, cool, okay, now what am I doing? Like, and actually think about like how incredible that truly is. Like,
how does this not blow your mind?
That's not a surface level thing. That wasn't like, oh wow, cool experience. That was, a significant breakthrough in mental health. Like, I mean, and the amount of detailed attention and obsession you need to have over the animals. Not everyone is necessarily cut out for that, but then those who are, it shows in the work that they do. It's some incredible stuff comes of it.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I just think and again, another thing, I wrote recently about how, herpetoculture on some level is still, we have a tendency to talk about the good old days, right? People post price lists from the 80s and you're just like, there was that? You could buy that for $100? Like, are you crazy? That's insane.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. That's interesting. That's history. That's whatever. Right. But like, we are still very much in the Wild West. Like, herpetoculture is a brand new industry, and there is so much. And so the thrust of the article was like, there is so much low hanging fruit in herpetoculture that someone with an even remotely industrious mind and a passion for what we do, you have an unbelievable amount of opportunity in this space. And we desperately need lots of people thinking about this in diverse ways, and lots of people doing very interesting stuff and showing it, talking about it, putting it all out there all the time. Like, we need that. And of course that would bring me to some of the ideas of like, what did I call it? Epistemic commitments, right? Like, we have to have a commitment to accuracy, truth, and transparency, a commitment to education and intellectual sparring. And any one of us would know that that's not exactly the case right now, right? You just post in a forum that you should keep your bearded dragon on sand, and people will freak out that it's going to impact it. It's like, all right, that's not how it really works. Or you post somewhere that I fed my uromastics, I feed them mealworms from time to time. Like, oh my God, these are strict herbivores. Don't you know these are hindgut fermenters? Whatever. It's like, okay, sure, fine. That's not intellectual sparring. That's like pile on, right? So and then when it comes to like truth and transparency and accuracy, that's also not happening either. There's no we all know people who get scammed. We all know people who got caught smuggling. We all know people who lied. Like when you go to buy a pair of animals from somebody, and you say, hey, are these unrelated? And they say yes, we just take that at face value. But there's there has to be multiple steps of verification beyond that, except in the case where you can verify, I don't mean to use myself as an example, but like, I have 30 different pairs of ornate uromastics. And so when I say I can get you an unrelated animal, I mean, I can get you an unrelated animal to another, like, easy, no problem. Right. Yeah. But like, that's because I have a lot of them. But outside of that, because I can show that I have all of that, there has to be some other way of like verifying that, yes, these are in fact actually unrelated, where it's not just a couple of siblings that I told you were unrelated and packed in the box and sent to you anyway, but there's not that. And so all of that kind of epistemic commitment has to happen at the level of the individual. It has to happen at the local level. Like, you have to make the decision that you're going to choose to do that right and in an ethical way indefinitely, Yeah.
And I think that will ultimately just come down to more people talking about it and making it the standard to where, if you are an up and coming keeper, breeder, whatever you want to call yourself, there's almost like a unspoken pressure to operate that way.
Oh yeah.
With like the risk of like ostracization if you're not that way, which right now it's almost kind of, being a little shisty is almost the standard, to where, if you're buying a snake from somebody and it's missexed, or, like what you were saying about related, unrelated, like these little diversions from the truth are almost kind of considered standard practice.
Totally.
And, that's obviously a very difficult topic to broach, but not broaching it is certainly not the solution.
Yeah. And there's also not like an externalized layer of accountability, because we all know people who do these kinds of things and just continue to operate because there's just enough people who don't know that person is a scammer or a liar or or whatever it is, and they just continue to operate sort of free of consequence on some level, and so that's hard. It's like, what would be a way to apply more layers of accountability to prevent that from happening more often. Like, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure what that would look like, because I also don't agree with like call out culture. I don't buy that, you know, like, so it's hard. It's like, how do you walk that line? And the only thing I've found to do is just to operate as best I can and make sure that I have a great reputation with people. And if someone ever complains or gets upset, like, I do what I can to make them happy, and, you know, and be like, hey, I can't tell you how many times I've replaced an animal when it wasn't my responsibility to do so because the person crushed it, or, you know, something like that. And it's like, just taking those extra steps to ensure that you can display to people that they can trust you for one reason or another. I think those are just unbelievably important things, but they they're like compound interest. They don't, the benefits of that don't show up tomorrow. They show up in 30 years, you know, right? Like, when you've had a customer for 30 years, or that customer has brought you 40 other customers that you have for 30 years, you know, that's how it happens, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it can be very tempting in the short run to cut a corner here. You know, will there be repercussions immediately? Probably not.
Maybe,
maybe, but more than likely, you know, unless it's something, if it's something major, then okay, sure. But like, oh, I sent a missexed animal to somebody. Well, I didn't completely explicitly say that it was going to be a female. I said it's probably a female. So, okay, I guess it wasn't a female. You know,
yeah,
you can get away with that in the court of public opinion, I guess, and
maybe
it'll be forgotten about in a month or whatever. But is that really how anyone wants to operate? Would you, as a customer, would you go out of your way to knowingly do business with somebody who has that reputation? Even if it's minimal stuff, you know, not like, there are people who obviously have very storied histories of being major scammers.
Sure.
Okay, that's one thing. But these kind of like somewhat excusable offenses, would you intentionally go into a deal with somebody who you didn't know?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. So
yeah, that's totally right. Yeah, that's the way I'm thinking about it too. It's like, it's just not the way we want the average vendor to behave, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So I want to go kind of back to something you touched on, of, you know, the fact that we are still in the infancy of this industry. You know, we're like maybe not even at the Industrial Revolution yet, so to speak.
Not even close.
What do you see as some of those needed innovations?
Oh man, I think all of the needed innovations revolve around lighting, diet, veterinary care, and enrichment. You know, I think. So I have a guy, my friend Brendan, who he worked for me for a while when I had the shop, and now he's got another job and he's doing his own thing, and we're buddies and stuff. He and I have like kind of this ongoing joke where like we'll do something a little bit different. Like, I throw a paper towel roll into the enclosure for €1 and they come over and explore it, and I take a picture of it and I go enrichment and I send it to him. You know, it's like a joke, right? Yeah. But it's not intended to put down the idea, right? Because obviously it's a good thing. You know, you should do it. But I think that those are the areas where it's going to be like and probably enclosures, right? Like getting out of the idea of like just a box. A box. It's something else. Like, you know, and this is a horrible example, but I think of like a hamster town, you know, where there's like tubes and a million different ways to explore and stuff. Obviously, it's maybe not necessarily applicable to herpetoculture in the same way, but like something like that. I think there's a ton of room for innovation and development in that space. I think there's a ton of room for innovation and development in diet, lighting, supplementation, veterinary care in particular. Veterinary care is very, very, it's like we're using leeches still, you know, on some level. It's like it's bad. It doesn't, no offense to vets, like vets are necessary and I use them, you know, but it's like, we've got to have, like even just veterinary education is not there. It just because it can't be tailored to every herp because they're all so different, you know? So it's like, there's just so many ways, I think. And then there's undoubtedly dozens and dozens of other areas that I can't think about because I'm just not creative enough or whatever it is to think about these other areas where we could see something change or something improve or something, you know, make a big impact. Right. So I think what it really has to be, if you don't want to work in one of those sort of pillar industries and innovate there, you have to probably going to have to get like really creative and be just kind of different, kind of be an outlier and on some level, and find some other hidden gem of insight or advancement that just when you hit it, it'll seem obvious once you do. And then but no one else had thought about it for some reason, for, you know, whatever it is. I mean, even, you know, I was thinking about like I spent a long time believing, I don't know why, but I spent a long time believing that like the UV lighting for reptiles was a direct evolution of the aquarium industry. And it's just not true. It's just not true at all. Right. So again, you dive into the research and the history of the topic and you find out actually like it was a completely independent development. It doesn't mean that people who were early reptile keepers didn't utilize aquarium lighting, but aquarium lighting did not have UVB at all. It had UVA and it had other things, but it did not have UVB. And so Zoomed was the company that released the very first UVB light for reptiles in 1993. And that was a big move. That was a huge game changer for the entire industry. Right.
Sure.
And so that's like an area where somebody's going to come up with something, you know, it turns out when you put ginseng on the crickets or something, like it just maximizes the animal's ability to perform its metabolic functions or some crap. I don't know, something weird like that, you know, but it's going to be stuff like that people, it's going to be all citizen scientists probably. You know, we have all this innovation happening around lighting, which is great, and we should continue to have it. But there's going to be more people who, you know, it was like Dean, the guy I mentioned at the beginning of the show, when we did the podcast with him, he said, you know, it's kind of weird that we feed all these nocturnal insects to diurnal lizards. And I was like, damn, never really thought about it like that. I mean, it's an obvious thing, but I just never thought about it. I took it for granted, you know? So I think there's just probably tons of that, even just within a particular genera, there's probably tons of that, you know? So I would love to, I mean, I don't know what it's all going to be, but I'm sure there's just going to be, especially when we have, you know, as all this globalization continues and we start having herpetoculturists pop up in places where it's a new field there, and maybe there's not like a great infrastructure in place. And so people are those constraints are going to make people get really creative. So we're probably going to see some of these weird innovations come out of like Mumbai, you know, or something, just some place where it's like, I don't really think of Mumbai as a hotbed for herpetoculture, but maybe it will be, you know, or wherever it is. So I'm absolutely stoked to see like what the next 30 to 30 years holds, you know. Hopefully I don't die in the interim, but you know.
No, it is, you know, really fascinating. And it's also interesting considering that there are just so many different sectors of the hobby. You can pay attention to what you're doing and have no idea what's going on elsewhere, and kind of gauge the trajectory of herpetoculture by your particular niche. And then, I mean, even to just, you know, I guess it's involved, but like the isopod market.
Oh yeah.
If you are, you know, if that's something that will never cross your mind, you would have no idea.
Yeah. It's mind blowing.
I mean, when I was like first getting into everything, I was making like dart frog cages, and I was, probably 11, 12 years old. There were springtails and isopods. Isopods were one thing.
Yeah. One thing. Yeah.
There was one thing called isopods. Now there's hundreds. Like, what the hell happened in that 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, my co-host Roy Arthur Blodgett, Wellspring Herpetoculture. He gave a talk. I think it was at the Reptile Talks recently. And his talk was about multi-species vivaria.
Yeah. Right.
And take it from me as someone whose like whole vibe is like solo housing and all this other stuff. But also I'm that guy where like I worry about interspecies predation and disease transfer when I think about interspecies vivaria, right? But like Roy is doing it successfully with some cool stuff. And that's a great example of like, that's a sea change where if a bunch of people start doing that, it's probably going to elucidate a lot of stuff that we didn't know, you know? The aquarium sphere has been doing this forever. And on some level, they saw it as like, this is a necessity. You have to have multi-species because they all serve a different purpose. And so it could be that at some point in the future, we decide, oh, well, it turns out that's actually the way to do it. You know, like maybe uromastyx and tortoises are actually better if you have them together for some reason, you know, or whatever it may be. So I think there's just so much fertile ground for disruption or innovation or whatever. And it just takes a slightly creative mind to try to see things through a slightly different lens or from an angle that maybe no one quite looked at it the same way before, you know. And so I'm guessing that, as you know, especially again as the whole thing grows, we're probably just going to see a lot more of that coming down the pike in the future. Yeah.
Well, it's exciting, man. I'm you know, it's a fun ride to be a part of, especially at this early stage. It's you know, I feel like we'll look back decades from now and be like, wow, that was a cool time to
well, and we have so many. So herpetoculture has a lot of other like sort of cousin or adjacent industries that we can sort of draw from. So like, you know, whether it's aquaculture, falconry, the domestication of other animals, like there's lots, right? But there's something about the evolution of like a new realm. So the analogy I like to use all the time is photography. So if you look at the advent of photography in the art world. So I went to college for art and design and had an art history education and stuff like that. When photography happened, basically the entirety of art history that had played out over hundreds of thousands of years or so or hundreds and thousands of years in painting and sculpture and all of that happened in the span of like 100 years in photography, because it was this new thing. And everybody was like, we could just take all the same stuff that we do with this other art and we're going to plug it into photography, you know? And so because of that, it all happened really fast to the point where photography, we take it for granted because it's right here.
Right.
You know? I think that's what's going to happen with herpetoculture. I think that we're going to it's not going to be slow. This is going to be really fast and really abrupt, to the point where like there are going to be people who are sort of Luddites who kind of get stuck with like, well, I've been doing it this way since I was a kid. I'm going to keep doing it this way. But there's going to be so many people who are just doing it like a totally different thing at some point.
Right.
You know? Or at least hopefully. I mean, maybe I'm not good at predicting the future in any way, shape, or form. Like I've been wrong about almost every assumption I've had about my own future in my life. So I'm probably wrong about all of this too. But like
maybe in like 200 years, a 40-gallon with newspaper will be like a film camera these days.
Yeah, totally.
Like,
yeah.
You have a 40-gallon in newspaper? Oh my gosh.
Well, but the film,
so cool.
But the film camera is the wrong analogy, because now that's like the hip thing to use. That's like the cool thing because it's got this own quality to it.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So it'd probably be more like it would be more like saying I'm going to take a vacation in Utah and I'm going to ride a horse there. It's like, why?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Just drive or fly. Like, what are you, nuts?
Yeah.
You know, like maybe it has its own charm, but it's like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, shoot. I mean, we could theoretically probably hit 5 hours right now, no problem.
Easy.
Yeah, but I think save that all for another time. We definitely need to do this again. This was awesome conversation as always.
Anytime.
Hell yeah. So for anyone who wants to keep up with what you're doing, follow your Patreon, podcasting, everywhere can people find you?
Yeah. So it's Arids Only pretty much everywhere. Arids Only. Right. I don't really post on Facebook much. I mean, I get in there once in a while and like make 5 posts and then log out and never look again because I hate Facebook. But I'm on Instagram, Arids Only, YouTube, Arids Only, Patreon, patreon.com/Arids Only, and then aridsonly.com. And then I have Roy and I do a podcast called Project Herpetoculture. It's been on about a hiatus for like almost a year because my wife and I had a baby, but we're back on it here. Like right now we're releasing a couple of like random episodes that we had kind of in the can, and we're recording new ones. So you can Project Herpetoculture everywhere you go. So yeah.
Nice. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited for the comeback. It's going to be fun.
Cool. Thanks, man.
All right. Yeah. Once again, dude, thank you so much for your time. And I love this conversation.
Yeah, ditto, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll close
Awesome.
up the show. But yeah, once again, dude, thank you very much. This was awesome time.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning into that episode. Great conversation with Phil as always. If you liked it, once again, please subscribe here on the YouTube channel. You can also find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast from. For me, I'm on Instagram at Scrub Shepherd, Stephen Kush on Facebook, Stephen Kush, or at Kush Reptile on YouTube, Kush Reptile on MORPH Market as well. And of course, here every Wednesday on the Trap Talk Reptile Network. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode. I'll catch you all back here next week for a new one. And